You've been told that the United States is too big to fail, too advanced, too central to the global system to ever collapse. But that belief is exactly what every dying empire told itself right before the ground disappeared beneath it. Over the last 500 years, three superpowers, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union, sat at the top of the world. Each controlled money, land, resources, and weapons. Each believed their dominance was permanent. And every one of them followed the same 7-step pattern straight into the grave. What no one wants to admit in 2025 is that the United States has already walked through 5 of those steps. We're not at the beginning of the script. We're deep in the middle of it. This isn't about America being good or bad. It's about something colder and far more predictable. A mechanism that repeats itself regardless of culture or politics. History doesn't negotiate. It just runs the same code again and again. The public story is comforting. Decline, if it ever comes, will be gentle and manageable. A slow fade. Nothing sudden, nothing catastrophic. You're told that technology and American exceptionalism are permanent cheat codes, that innovation will outrun debt, that global leadership can be extended indefinitely. But here's what they don't tell you. Spain believed its silver mines were a cheat code. Britain believed its navy and empire were a cheat code. The Soviet Union believed its ideology and military strength were cheat codes. All three were wrong, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they ignored the math that governs empires. Empires don't die because one leader makes one bad decision. They die when a series of choices pushes them past a threshold, and the structure that once looked invincible suddenly collapses under its own weight. Collapse doesn't begin when foreign armies appear at the capital. It begins when an empire spends more energy maintaining its position than its economy can generate. It looks like this. Military commitments everywhere, alliances and wars that cost more than they return, governments funding impossible promises with impossible debt, financial systems that paper over every weakness with more money creation. On the surface, everything still looks strong. Currencies spend, armies intimidate, markets rise, but underneath, the foundations rot. Capital stops building real industries and chases speculation instead. Skilled people stop innovating and start gaming the system. Allies begin to hedge, enemies probe, partners seek alternatives. And slowly, the greatest advantages of the empire flip into liabilities. The global military becomes financially unsustainable. The reserve currency becomes a burden as it floods back home. The once trusted promises of the empire start sounding like empty slogans. That exact sequence destroyed Spain, then Britain, then the Soviet Union. So let's rewind to where the pattern first emerged. In the late 1500s, Spain felt exactly the way America feels today. Dominant, wealthy, untouchable. They controlled vast territories across Europe and the Americas. They crushed the Aztec and Inca empires and seized the richest silver deposits ever found. By the mid-1500s, Spanish fleets were hauling hundreds of tons of silver across the Atlantic every year. Spain effectively controlled Europe's money supply. Their coins became the world's preferred currency. Inside the empire, people believed the golden age would last forever. And that is where the first stage of collapse began. When you believe your wealth is infinite, your ambitions expand without limit. Spain fought everyone. Ottomans, French, Italians, the Dutch, the English, across 4 continents. Half of royal revenue was consumed by the military, and even that wasn't enough. From the outside, Spain still looked unstoppable. From the inside, it was bleeding out. When taxes and plunder couldn't cover the cost of empire, Spain turned to the classic tool of decline. Currency manipulation. They diluted their silver coins with cheaper metals like copper. And the face value stayed the same, but the real value didn't. Inflation spread. Trust weakened. You've seen the modern version of this. Today we expand balance sheets instead of mixing metals, but the effect is the same. Debasement buys time, but never fixes the underlying problem. So Spain did what every overextended empire does. It borrowed. From Italian bankers, German financiers, anyone willing to believe the silver would flow forever. But it didn't. Spain defaulted multiple times, massive bankruptcies that signaled the truth. The empire's wealth was an illusion held together by loans. And here's the part almost no one understands. Spain wasn't destroyed by a lack of money. It was destroyed by too much unearned money. When silver poured in endlessly, Spaniards stopped producing. Why grow food when you can import it? Why build ships when you can buy them? Why innovate when you can simply pay others? The nobility treated real work with contempt. Domestic industry withered. Agriculture stagnated. The empire became a pipeline. Silver came in. Goods flowed out. Wealth didn't stay. Capability didn't stay. Only the illusion stayed. When the mines inevitably produced less, Spain had no engine of real production to support itself. The collapse was already baked in. Social decay followed. Crime rose, poverty spread, and the most talented citizens fled to rising nations like England and the Dutch Republic. On maps, Spain still looked enormous. In reality, it was hollow, a giant with no pulse. That is what collapse looks like from the inside. Slow, arrogant, invisible, until it's too late. And Spain was only the first example. The pattern repeats, next with Britain, then the Soviet Union. And finally, you'll see exactly where the United States stands inside that same sequence right now. 300 years after Spain's fall, the pattern resurfaced inside the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. At the dawn of the 1900s, Britain controlled a quarter of the Earth's landmass and ruled over 400 million people. London was the center of global banking. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British ships controlled nearly every major trade route on the planet. And, just like Spain, Britain believed its supremacy was unshakable. But beneath the shine of the imperial facade, the same gears of decline were already turning. Military overreach was the first crack. By 1900, Britain was responsible for defending vast territories across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. An empire that large doesn't just require power. It requires permanent energy, money, and manpower simply to hold together. The cost was enormous. And when World War I erupted in 1914, Britain faced a decision that would decide its fate. Stay out and preserve the empire, or dive in and bankrupt itself to win a war that wasn't truly about survival. Britain chose the second option. The war consumed everything: money, industry, gold reserves, and the national psyche. To pay for weapons, food, fuel, and American goods, Britain shipped massive quantities of gold across the Atlantic. The empire that once lent money to the world was suddenly borrowing from the United States. When the war ended, Britain had won militarily, but lost economically. And like every empire before it, it tried to pretend nothing had changed. The next stage was currency distortion. Before World War I, the pound sterling had been backed by gold at a fixed rate. It was the anchor of the world's financial system. But after the war, Britain didn't have the gold to justify the old exchange rate. Instead of resetting the currency to a realistic value, they tried to restore the pound to its pre-war strength, an act of political pride that came with devastating economic consequences. Overvalued currency made British exports expensive and uncompetitive. Factories slowed, unemployment rose. To defend the pound, interest rates had to stay painfully high. The domestic economy suffocated under the weight of a fantasy exchange rate. This denial lasted until 1931, when Britain finally abandoned the gold standard. The pound plunged, global markets reeled. The world realized what Britain had been denying. The empire was mortally wounded. Debt was the next tightening of the noose. Britain never recovered from the financial shock of World War I. And just when the economy was beginning to stabilize, World War II detonated across Europe. Once again, Britain chose to fight. Once again, the cost was catastrophic. By the end of World War II, Britain owed the United States and Canada more money than its entire GDP. They had won the war, but lost the empire. The collapse of imperial holdings accelerated. In 1947, Britain gave up India, the jewel of the empire, the source of wealth and manpower that had sustained it for centuries. Over the next 2 decades, almost every colony followed. Nations across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean broke free, one after another. By the early 1970s, the empire existed only as a memory. And then came the final humiliation, the long, painful decline of the pound. For generations, the pound sterling had been the king of global finance, but by the late 20th century, it had devolved into a regional currency. The numbers tell the story, from over $4 per pound in the mid-20th century down to nearly 1-to-1 in later decades. Each drop was another reminder that Britain's dominance had evaporated. Britain still kept the symbols of power, a permanent UN Security Council seat, nuclear weapons, the image of partnership with the United States, but the substance had vanished. The empire that the sun never set on had become a country struggling to pay its own bills. And the world moved on. This brings us to the third example, the Soviet Union, an empire that collapsed so quickly it shocked even the people who lived inside it. After World War II, the USSR emerged from the ashes as the only true rival to the United States. They had nuclear weapons, massive industrial capacity, and a rigid ideology that promised to reshape humanity. For 45 years, the Soviet Union competed with America for global dominance. They built more tanks, more missiles, more satellites. But behind the military theater, their economy was quietly suffocating. The first problem was military overextension. The USSR spent an extraordinary share of its GDP, up to 20%, on defense and geopolitical commitments. They supported communist movements around the world, bankrolled allies like Cuba and Syria, funded proxy wars in Africa and Asia, and fought a decade-long war in Afghanistan that drained resources and morale. Matching American military power required money the Soviet system couldn't generate. Then came economic stagnation. Central planning seemed efficient on paper, but in practice, it strangled innovation. Factories produced garbage. Farms failed repeatedly. Technology lagged behind the West by decades. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union was importing grain to feed its people, a stunning failure for a country with some of the world's best farmland. The currency issue made everything worse. The ruble was not a real currency in global markets. It couldn't be exchanged freely. Soviets used US dollars in secret whenever possible because they didn't trust their own money. To buy foreign goods, the Soviet government had to pay in gold or oil. And when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, they ran out of both. The empire began to crack. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Eastern European satellite states broke away. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia. The geopolitical buffer that had protected the Soviet Union evaporated. Moscow was powerless to stop it. And then the final collapse arrived with breathtaking speed. In December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. No invasion, no foreign conquest, just economic implosion. The ruble became worthless. The government couldn't pay the military. The political structure disintegrated. A nuclear superpower collapsed more suddenly than almost any empire in history. The pattern had repeated again. Overreach, distortion, debt, decay, collapse. And now, for the fourth time in 500 years, the same forces are gathering, this time around the United States. In the final section, we'll map each stage of the pattern onto America today and show where we truly are in the sequence. And now we arrive at the part no one wants to confront. The pattern is unfolding again, and this time the empire inside it is the United States. Look at the sequence, and the overlap becomes impossible to ignore. Military overextension? America has over 750 bases across the planet, troops deployed in more than 150 countries, and obligations stretching from Europe to the Middle East to the Pacific. No empire in history has ever carried a security burden this large without breaking under its own weight. Currency debasement? Since leaving the gold standard in 1971, the U.S. dollar has lost nearly all of its original purchasing power. In the last 2 decades, money creation accelerated at a speed that previous empires could only dream of. And fear. Trillions printed, deficits normalized, and every crisis solved by issuing more debt disguised as stimulus. The mechanism is modern. The consequences are ancient. Debt spiral. The United States owes more than its entire economy produces, and interest payments alone are sprinting toward $1 trillion a year. America is now borrowing not to invest, not to grow, but simply to pay yesterday's bills. Exactly the behavior that signaled collapse in Spain, in Britain, and in the Soviet Union. Loss of productive capacity. The country that once built the world now imports nearly everything it uses. Electronics, medicine, steel, energy components, even essentials for the military. The U.S. still designs and innovates, but the physical backbone of production has migrated overseas. When supply chains break, the illusion of strength evaporates. Social decay, trust in government, media, and institutions has cratered. Cities struggle with homelessness and crime. Political polarization has replaced consensus. Fertility rates have collapsed below replacement. A nation cannot project unity abroad when it is fracturing at home. 5 stages. All checked. The only 2 left are the most dangerous: loss of reserve currency status and systemic collapse. And the early signs are everywhere. Nations are diversifying away from the dollar. BRICS countries are experimenting with alternatives. China and Russia trade in their own currencies. Saudi Arabia, long anchored to the petrodollar, is opening the door to yuan settlement. Central banks worldwide are buying gold at rates not seen in half a century. They're not preparing for today. They're preparing for the world after the dollar. If the United States loses its monopoly over global settlement, trillions of dollars will rush back into America, igniting inflation and breaking the financial system from the inside. That is the moment when an empire doesn't decline. It snaps. The Soviet Union collapsed in 900 days. Britain lost its empire in a single generation. Spain never recovered, and every one of them insisted until the very end that they were different. Today, America tells itself the same story. But the pattern doesn't care about exceptions, and history doesn't reward denial. Maybe the United States will reform. Maybe it will rebuild the foundations that past empires refused to fix. Maybe this time truly is different. But the math says otherwise. And if you know the pattern, you can already feel how close we are to the edge. When stage 6 arrives, it will come fast. When stage 7 begins, it will be irreversible. The only question left is whether we recognize the warning signs before the collapse becomes the next chapter in the long, repeating story of dying empires.